Good evening, everyone. My name is Kyla Hannington, and I'm the Public Outreach and Engagement Division Manager with the Prince George's County Office of Human Rights, the county's civil and human rights education and enforcement agency. We are the folks in Prince George's County who investigate complaints of discrimination. We combat human trafficking. We ensure equitable language access to county government resources, and we build relationships across diverse peoples. It is my absolute pleasure tonight to join with my co-hosts, Renee Battlebrooks and Andrea Lopez, and our partners, the Prince George's County Memorial Library System, in bringing you this special event in honor of the 60th anniversary of the March on Washington and the 10th anniversary of the publication of the book, March. August 28th, 1963, the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. That was 60 years ago. But for so many of us, that march, the speeches, the impact, and the legacy have been facts of our lives. And we've grown up in a world shaped by that action, by similar actions around the nation around the same time. And John Lewis, who would serve as congressman for 33 years, was one of the speakers at the March on Washington. He was a leader and a participant in so many of these foundational moments, country improving, life-changing movements, the freedom rides, sit-ins, marching across the Edmund Pettus Bridge. And 10 years ago, the first graphic novel, March, was published, co-written by John Lewis and Andrew Aydin with art by Nate Powell. The trilogy March tells Representative Lewis's journey, his long fight for civil and human rights, and serves as a reminder about how each of us can stand up for injustice. So we are honored, very honored, to have with us this evening co-author Andrew Aydin, a #1 New York Times bestselling author, a National Book Award winner, a Robert F. Kennedy Book Award honoree, a Prince Award winner, a Sibert Medal winner, a Walter Dean Myers Award winner, 3-time Eisner Award winner, and the recipient of multiple Coretta Scott King Honors. Andrew is creator and co-author of the graphic memoir series March and Run, which chronicles the life of Congressman and civil rights icon John Lewis. Co-authored with Representative Lewis, March was the first comics work to ever win the National Book Award. An Atlanta native, Andrew is a Turkish American who was raised by a single mother. He served as special assistant to Connecticut Lieutenant Governor Kevin B. Sullivan and district aide to Representative John Larson before joining the staff of Representative John Lewis in 2007, where Andrew served in several capacities, including campaign communications director and digital director and policy advisor until Representative Lewis's passing in 2020. A graduate of Trinity College in Hartford and Georgetown University in Washington, D.C., Andrew wrote his master's thesis on the history and impact of Martin Luther King and the Montgomery story. Andrew has appeared as a guest on The Rachel Maddow Show, Morning Joe, at CBS This Morning, as well as on National Public Radio, CNN, BBC, CBC, and others. Andrew's lecture with Representative Lewis during the 2019 Vermont Reads statewide reading program was featured in the PBS special, The Story of March, released in 2020. And in 2019, I know this is a long bio, but it's because it's awesome, and I'm going to give you the whole thing. I really need you to know who we're talking to. In 2019, Andrew joined with Kelly Sue DeConnick, Matt Fraction, Valentine DeLandro, and Vaughn Chanel to found Good Trouble Productions to produce innovative nonfiction graphic novel and multimedia projects, including Run, a sequel series to the March trilogy, civics and history comic books for the New York City Department of Education, as well as The Long March, a large-scale custom art installation and online experience from Ben & Jerry's factory in Vermont. He frequently lectures at schools and universities, as well as participating in reading programs with incarcerated youth. Andrew is a judge for the Los Angeles Times Book Prize, having also served previously in 2018 and 2019. He's the co-writer of the March virtual reality immersive experience produced by Time Inc. and released in 2020. And some of his comic works include the Captain America story, Home of the Brave, in Marvel Comics Presents #3 from Marvel, Truth and Justice #6, Batman Gotham Knights #16, and Titans Together #3 from DC Comics, as well as the 2020 Battle for the Vote comic PSA, produced in partnership with Rock the Vote. Andrew's prose work includes articles for the Atlanta Alt Weekly Creative Loafing and the Southern Poverty Law Center's Teaching Tolerance magazine. So it is absolutely an honor to have you. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I can't believe it's been 10 years.
It goes fast, yeah?
Yeah. As I said earlier, I was a younger man then. It's, I don't know, it's been such a strange period of just remembrance.
Yeah.
You know, It's funny. I'll start off with an embarrassing confession. The reason March was published on August 13th, originally the publisher had suggested we publish it closer to the anniversary of the March on Washington. And the congressman was like, maybe we should move it. And then I had a very personal reason to move it. So arrogant was I at 29 years of age that I moved the publication date 2 weeks earlier because my 30th birthday was going to be on August 25th. And by moving it 2 weeks earlier, that meant that I would be eligible for a New York Times bestseller list before my 30th birthday. And I had this big bet with my mother, and I was not going to lose. And my publisher thought I was absolutely nuts that March could debut on the New York Times bestseller list. Absolutely nuts. We had a wager, and he would have bet the farm if he could have. But lo and behold, the first New York Times bestseller list that March was eligible for, it debuted at number 1, and that was released on August 24th, 2013. So I pulled it off by a day and became a number 1 New York Times bestselling author in my 20s, which seems so preposterous when you really think about it, especially when you're coming at it with a comic book, fundamentally. But I guess if there's any lesson to take away from that is it you have to believe in yourself, because even the folks, who are doing business with you and things like that, like you have to find that inner strength and that just inner resolve. And I won that bet with my mother. My mother was very pleased to lose that bet. And up until the day she died, she reminded me of like that was the boy she raised.
That's beautiful. That's beautiful.
That's a great story. And I love that you have to believe in yourself. I love the call to internal action for all of us to achieve some of these things.
Yeah.
And it actually does tie in with something that I was struck with in the opening pages of this. It's amazing. And I'm not a young kid. It was really well done. And I was struck by the congressman's love for chickens, and it kind of fits in like he knew himself, right? He knew he was an oddity for his family, right? Growing up on a farm, like chickens are not pets, right? I was just struck by that. Tell us a little bit for those who haven't had it's an insight into a person.
Well, one of the things we tried really hard to do in March is to provide those little stories that actually show you he was a human being, right? I mean, it's pretty audacious to start off a book with the congressman brushing his teeth. But that was it, right? He put on his pants one leg at a time.
That's right.
He, got voicemails and checked them in the morning, and, all these sort of things. And when you think about his love of chickens, right? I mean, like, he'll tell you the chicken story, and that story has been redone many, many times. But when you talk about how the human being, it's when you've been in his house or you've been in his office and you see all the little knickknacks that he collected over the years, the little glass chickens, the folk art chickens, all these sort of things. Because, one of the things that Congressman and I, we did this together actually quite a bit, is he loved to go to auctions and he loved to go to flea markets and antiques markets, right? And so that's what he would always be looking for. And sometimes, you'd see the great John Lewis carrying out an oversized, hand-painted chicken because he thought it would look great in his house, But that's who he was. That's who he was as a human being. And I think in some ways that's what contributed to people feeling so connected to him through March, is because there wasn't I think we're dealing with this today with John Lewis's memory and the way he's being celebrated, is that in some ways there's an effort afoot to treat him like a Disney character and to round off those edges and to take away the parts of him that don't necessarily fit your traditional hero mold, that make him a real human being. But when we take that part of his story away, when we take away the parts that make him real and show him as a human being, we make it too hard and too difficult for other people to feel like they can follow in his footsteps.
Mhm.
Because John Lewis would always say, I was just trying to help out. People, oh, you had so much courage, Congressman. How did you do all that? And he'd just say, I'm just trying to help out. And that really was his belief. There was instances where he could just help. And so he needed to help. But if we don't show that this was a man who had a sweet tooth and loved a blueberry muffin every morning for breakfast and had a deep sense of appreciation for art, that he I remember he used to, I don't know if anybody knows the Swan Gallery, but they would have auctions of art, particularly African American artists, and the congressman would joke, I can't afford any of this, but I would love to look at the catalog. And so he'd have me call the art house just to get him a copy of the catalog so he could look at it, and he'd follow the artists. And that's in some ways that's the manifestation of how March as a part of his being, is that it was a combination of so many things that he loved: honesty, authenticity, art, storytelling, literature, books. And when you find that special mix and you're able to bring it all together in a I mean, shoot, our publisher had all 4 people, including the warehouse guy. Like, this was not a manufactured effort. It was about as grassroots as it got. I mean, I was paying for my own expenses during this with student loan debt to survive, right? Like, we were just doing everything we could to get by and get it done and get it out. That is so important for people to know, because otherwise, even making something like March seems impossible. But it's not. I mean, I was 24 years old when I suggested this idea to the congressman. And I think, especially as I interact with a lot of, I live in this weird bubble where, like, my phone rings all day with people calling for advice. And some of them want to know how to write a book. Some of them want to know how to pass a bill. Some of them want a policy, all these different things. And the thing that would serve all of them better than anything else, and I always tell them this, is that, like, listen to the young people. Don't be beholden to someone's station or their title.
Yeah.
Like, listen to the people around you, experience the people around you, hear what they have to say, listen to their ideas. And the people who have good ideas and fight for them, stand with them, participate with them, work with them, because that's how you get here. I mean, I started in John Lewis's office answering his mail, and then barely 15 years later, I'm a National Book Award, I'm all these things, right? Like,
Yeah.
But all of that is because John Lewis didn't stand on position. It's because he listened to a young man with an idea, and then he kept listening to it, and then that evolved into all these other sort of things, right? Getting him on social media. I mean, Good Trouble came about because we used it as a hashtag, and we tweeted out his mugshot, and all these sort of things that were kind of like the older guard thought was not a good idea at the time. But John Lewis served and lived an example of a willingness to both reinvent himself and to experience the people around him in such an honest and authentic way that together everyone became stronger.
That's such a lesson that transcends everything, right? No matter what you're trying to do. Kyla? Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Well, actually, so I have so many things to talk to you about, but I'm going to try to back us up a little bit, because one of the things I was hoping you could do before we got too into it was just like a little foundation, in case some of our viewers aren't as familiar with John Lewis as we are. Are you able to just do a little introduction to John Lewis before we get into the more details about the book?
Sure. I think the most important things to know about John Lewis is that I believe he was one of 10 children, or he had 10 brothers and sisters. I may be leaving one out. I'm sorry. And I say I'm sorry to the brothers and sisters and the nephews who I get to hang out with, and even sometimes they admit they get confused. Because he has a huge family, right? So he was the oddball in his family. Congressman say he's a little maladjusted at the time, right? And he grew up on a farm in rural Alabama. As he would say, 300 acres of cotton, corn, cows, hogs, and peanuts. I can do it. It's in my head. And he went to he wanted to go to school. He would actually hide under the front porch, and these are all stories you'll read in March. But he would hide under the front porch of his family's home near Carter's Corners in South Alabama, about 90 miles from Montgomery, near Troy, and it was in school that he met these librarians. I remember the librarian, one of them that stuck with him was Corinne Harvey. And she said, read, my child, read everything. And that played a huge role in his life. So he becomes, he wouldn't say he was the best student, but he worked very hard to learn. And he also, this is when he became frustrated for the first time, or understood for the first time, segregation and the not just the separation, but the differences in resources. Seeing the shiny white buses for the white school children, so different than the ones that he was riding. And then he grew up to go, and he started preaching to the chickens, and he eventually went to American Baptist Theological Seminary. It was his mother's suggestion. He wanted to be a preacher. And it was there that he met the Reverend Jim Lawson at Kelly Miller Smith's Baptist Church in downtown Nashville. And that's really where it all started. And then John Lewis goes on to be one of the original participants in the Nashville sit-in movement, one of the original Freedom Riders, the youngest speaker at the March on Washington, one of the organizers of the Mississippi Freedom Summer and a Democratic challenge at the Atlantic City Convention, and then ultimately, as many of us know, the co-leader of the march, the first march from Selma to Montgomery, when he was beaten. And then there's a lot more story after that, but I think that gets us started.
It's interesting that when I was reading this, just what you touched on, I was struck anew. It hit me and it resonated in a different way when he was talking about looking out and seeing the bus of those that had more the pavements. And I was in, the dirt road versus the pavement, the shiny new this and the that. And I was struck again about sort of our struggle in this country and the inequities and this concept that people are like, oh, just pull yourself up by your bootstraps, right? When that's not what it's about. And so I thought that the way it was portrayed was beautifully done. It just, again, just brought home that this is bigger than that. This is not, right? Sort of.
That's part of the power of a graphic novel.
Right.
Because, there's old adage for writers, which is show, don't tell. But graphic novels, comics, sequential narrative fundamentally allows you to show rather than tell in a much more profound way.
Yeah. Yeah.
And when you see that panel or those panels of John Lewis looking out from his ramshackle school bus at the shiny school bus with white children passing him by, that does far more for the imagination to put yourself in his shoes than anything else we could write down on paper.
Yeah. Totally agree. It was beautiful. Kyla, Andrea?
Well, they putting you on the spot there, Andrea.
I see. So I'm gonna kind of backtrack to when you had mentioned you starting off with John Lewis and a 24-year-old, you're presenting this idea, and you had mentioned about how you always get asked for advice. So my question is, what advice would you give someone who is just now embarking on their career in social justice, civil rights activism, or just even wanting to be a writer? Presenting ourselves in being young and then presenting ourselves to an older generation who may not be open-minded to our ideas. What advice would you give to us?
That's a fantastic question. I think to the first part about starting your career and figuring out your own path, remember, almost every job I've had and all of the jobs that I'm remembered for having are jobs I created. They did not exist. I was one of the first digital directors on Capitol Hill. Okay. I got John Lewis on social media, right? And I remember all the years of hand-wringing about, the older generation just being like, just as an example of the absurdity, right? Where you get the older staffer who's like, I'm going to write a tweet and it's like 45 hashtags. And you're like, okay, that's not how hashtag works, right? And you're like struggling to explain it, but that's natural. You're going to go through that. And hopefully the people you're working with can be respectful and you can be respectful as you find that middle ground. But I think from the larger perspective of you need to look at it as you actually have this rare ability at your age to see the future, because the future is being made by your generation. The reality that will exist when you're my age is a reality you will create either voluntarily or involuntarily, right? So take the point of view of like, how do I shape this? Don't be afraid to make the suggestions, Don't be afraid to, as I did, suggest Congressman Lewis should get on social media. Then everybody sort of looks at it as an afterthought until it gets really notable. And then all of a sudden they care about it. There's this progression that happens. Same thing with March. But underneath that, and this is maybe the hardest part, is you need to look to work for people and with people who have the ability to see value and to see young people for who they are. Right? I mean, John Lewis might as well have had a big neon sign behind him saying, I get it, because he spoke at the March on Washington when he was 23. He was a young person in the room. He was the one pushing Dr. King and others so many of the most radical reforms, or at least they were thought of as radical at the time, but that we take for granted now, that came about during the civil rights movement, were the ones pushed by the young people of SNCC and in the movement. The example I always go back to is that in the original version of the Civil Rights Act of '64, there was a draft language that would have required people to have a 6th grade education to register and vote. And it was the young people in SNCC who were like, no, this is unacceptable, and ultimately got that language removed. Right. And this is something we take as self-evident or obvious today. But back then, somebody had to speak up for it. Somebody had to say, no, this is unacceptable. And then to your other question, I think about how you write, how you publish. I mean, look, if you had told little 13-year-old me who'd gone to his first or second Dragon Con that I would be able to both work in politics and write comics, that my refuge after my mentor died would be to go write Batman, like I wouldn't have believed you, because it didn't seem possible.
Right.
But every time I've found a story or written a work that gained significant resonance, that story found me before I found it. John Lewis's story found me. If I hadn't been on that campaign in 2008, working as his press secretary, traveling around with him, staffing him, hearing him tell all of these stories from the movement that I had never heard as a young person, right? Even growing up in Atlanta, nobody taught me about what SNCC did. If I hadn't had that experience and that opportunity, and those stories hadn't found me, then there would have been no march, right? And at the same time, that means you have to be open to hearing when those stories come a calling. Right? The book I'm working on right now, it's about the Gullah, and it's deeply meaningful to me because one of my mother's best friends when I was growing up was Gullah, and she would speak to me in Gullah as a child. So it was something that, like, when I hear it, it's almost like I'm a kid again. And when my mother passed away in 2017, we had the service, and the reception afterwards, I had to give my mother's eulogy, right? And I can't tell you how hard that is to give your mother's eulogy, especially as an only child, like running the whole thing and everything like that. And then the service happened, and there was a lot of like, great job on the eulogy, and then they're going to the reception, and I mean, there was muckety muck people there, which my mother would have probably had mixed feelings about, but John Lewis came, and that was meaningful, and they were everybody's taking selfies, and I really felt alone in that space. And Barbara, my mother's Gullah friend, had read about the service in the Atlanta paper because they did a beautiful article about my mother, which I also would have been curious about her feelings about. Because I know they started on the mother of National Book Award winning author. My mother would have been like, I did more than that, you know. And Barbara came and she sat me down and she started, and I was like, Barbara, do you still speak Gullah? And she just started talking to me like she used to. And then it was like it saved me that day, right? And then a few weeks later, my cousins called me and said they'd been down to Defusky Island, which is across the way from Tybee and Hilton Head in South Carolina. And they said, we met this wonderful woman. She's Gullah and she's written a cookbook. We think you should meet her. And they introduced me to this woman, Sally Ann Robinson, who is Ethel in The Water is Wide by Pat Conroy. And we got to be friends. And we started speaking every Monday at 2:00, just regular check-in phone call. And eventually it started to seem almost inevitable that I would write a graphic novel about her and with her. Because that was the story finding me. Mama left me a solution to how I healed. These people come into your life, and that the gift that I can give is to help elevate their story.
Right.
And so I've spent the last, especially it was after the congressman passed that I really was like, okay, Sally Ann, we're doing a book. And I've spent the last 2 years, now the publishers are kind of all fighting over who gets it, which is kind of funny because, well, to be very real, very frank and very candid, she's a dark Black woman. And I don't think if I had come in, they would. But that's my privilege. That's what I have to do. That's what I should do. But her story, Sally Ann, she found me. And you've got to be open to seeing the value that other people do not see in stories in your life. And it's a difficult skill to hone, right? I mean, but look at it in the context of March. When John Lewis and I first started this, he was, he almost lost his seat in 2008. He was in a lot of trouble. People kept saying, what have you done for me lately? His chief of staff had settled a lawsuit because the way he treated a staffer. There was a lot of bad things going on. And yet, to me, there was so much that needed to be told about him, of these stories that I'm hearing for the first time. So you got to keep your eyes and ears open, right? Because the John Lewis we celebrate today is not the John Lewis that I first met. And you can play as much of a role in other people's lives as I did in John Lewis's. And the thing is, too, it's those relationships become the most meaningful relationships in your life. Congressman would often say I was like a son to him, and I would say he's like a father to me. And I know there's a lot of jostling amongst a lot of politicians about who mentored who. But the truth is, good people like John Lewis, the way you can tell who he cares about is who they spent the most time working with. Actually building things, making things. We made a lot over the years. And you need to think about how you can be that kind of person who makes things. Fundamentally, it comes down to, are you a maker or are you a taker? And you want to be.
Thank you so much. Yeah. I feel like, the Office of Human Rights definitely has, leadership that is open to new ideas, and coming together and pushing things out. So thank you so much.
Oh, thank you for the question, Andrea.
That was awesome. Thank you very much for that. I did want to ask a question, and I wanted to talk. I just actually kind of want to take a second, actually, because everything you had to share was really powerful. So I want to make a little space. Thank you. And I did want to ask a question about the march's impact. It's been 10 years since it's come out, and how, what have you seen? And I will say, and that was kind of where I wanted to go when, I asked a question yet, but we actually have a question from a viewer that may or may not be my dad. That's relevant to where I was going to go. So first of all, hi, Kyla's dad. And so the question is, what is your response to states that are banning books and even lessons on Black history? And he said, for example, telling schools to not teach AB Black history. And so I was wondering if I want to talk about, I mean, maybe this might be a very long question, but like how we see March's impact and then what's happening now. So.
Well, let me start at the beginning a little bit. One of the tenets of nonviolent civil disobedience is that before you begin a direct action campaign, you have to write down and explain both what you're doing, why you're doing it, and what your objective is. And the congressman and I did that. Just before March Book 1 was released, matter of fact, it would have been 10 years ago last week, we guest edited an issue of the local alt weekly paper Creative Loafing on the future of nonviolence. And we brought together luminaries in the field, academics, elected officials, former participants in the movement. I wrote the feature article, which was the history of Martin Luther King and the Montgomery story, to explain that essentially it wasn't that weird that John Lewis was doing a comic book, that Dr. King himself had helped edit a comic book to inspire some of the earliest acts of civil disobedience of the movement, and that his mentor, Jim Lawson, had actually been the person who helped distribute those comic books, using them in nonviolence workshops throughout the South between 1958 and 1960. And in that, we also wrote essentially what would be considered sort of an op-ed, but really like a letter from us that said, right now there's something in the United States called the 9-word problem, which is a term coined by the Southern Poverty Law Center that said most students graduated from high school only knowing 9 words about the civil rights movement: Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King, I Have a Dream. And that's it. And our goal was to fix that. And at the same time, the other part of our goal was to create what we called a new nonviolent revolution in America, that we were hoping to inspire and educate young people sufficiently that they could stand up much in the same way that the young people of SNCC did. And we accomplished both of those things. By 2019, March Book 1 having been out in the world less than 6 years, and March Book 3 having been out in the world less than 3 years, the series had become one of, if not the most widely taught graphic novels in America, as well as one of, if not the most widely taught civil rights texts in America. So we felt like we felt very optimistic. I will never forget there's a few different events that I think point to March essentially doing what the congressman would call creating the climate and the environment for change. One is that it often gets forgotten that before the gun control sit-in of 2016, the congressman and I had led, along with Nate Powell, the artist and illustrator of March, a children's march through the San Diego Comic-Con, quite literally illustrating our goal of trying to lead a new generation to march. And this, I believe, inspired many of the members, particularly the Democratic caucus, to think, how else can they use the tools and tactics of the civil rights movement to influence policy? And at the same time, I was on the congressman's staff, and I ran social media for the gun control sit-in, right? So we had all these images ready to go when they cut the cameras, that then C-SPAN ran on a loop that were essentially sequential narrative images, right? Much like we made in our comic books. Then the following year, we went and did, this would be 2017, we went and did a large-scale reading program in Miami-Dade County, where the Knight Foundation funded the purchase of thousands of slipcases that they gave to students all across the region. This ended up being, I believe, a month or two before the terrible shooting in Parkland. And then you see those students organize one of the largest marches against gun violence that the United States had ever seen. And they were organizing under the banner for much of this online, as we had suggested in our talks, and using the hashtag Good Trouble.
Mm.
By 2019, March is one of the most, it's almost ubiquitous in American schools, which starts to become, I believe, a political problem in some ways to the far right. I'll actually, you know what, there was another one that I forgot to point out, which is that when the former president was sworn into, or just before he was sworn in or inaugurated, he said some rather nasty things about the congressman. And the American public responded in what I believe to be the only dignified way. They sent and mailed thousands of copies of March to the White House.
Wow.
So that when he came into the White House, his mailroom was filled with thousands of copies of March.
Wow.
So by the time March has then had the opportunity to be taught to a full generation of middle school and high school students, this is effectively 2020. You see the uprisings begin in response to the murder of George Floyd. Congressman Lewis goes in May of 2020 to Black Lives Matter Plaza. He sees Black Lives Matter written down the center of the road, just like the cover of March Book 3. And he calls me and he tells me, and he just says he's so excited. He was like, it looks just like the cover. It's like they just did exactly what we did on the cover. And then he paused and he thought, and he said, son, this is the March generation. He saw those uprisings as the fruits of his labor. We had emulated Jim Lawson's plan that I sussed out in my graduate thesis of using these comic books to go, and we did hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of events over these years, going into places many people had forgotten. Deepest parts of Texas and Arkansas, Mississippi and Georgia and Florida, all throughout the South and all throughout the rest of the country, as far away as Seattle and California and Moorhead, Minnesota and South Dakota. We went everywhere. And these schools would have huge reading programs, giving away thousands of copies. And we would give our lectures and we would talk and we would give the lessons. And there was a number of things that we brought up, one of which was student loan debt. I will never forget Congressman Lewis being so shocked that we got invited to the New York Federal Reserve Bank to speak to the entire bank about March. And I told the congressman, I'm not going to let this opportunity fly by. I would like to say some things that some might consider radical. And the congressman said, you go right ahead, young man. And there were two things that I said. This would have been April of 2015. And I said, I need you to promise me you will help me with two things. One, I need you to help me make sure that March is taught in every school in America. And they all laughed. And then I said, two, we have to do something about student loan debt. Let me put it into context for you. Imagine if John Lewis and the young people of SNCC had graduated from American Baptist Theological Seminary or Fisk University or Meharry Medical School or Morehouse College or anywhere in the AUC or anywhere in North Carolina, UNC Greensboro, or any of these other schools that were graduating some of these tremendous leaders of the civil rights movement. And imagine if they had graduated being burdened by tens of thousands of dollars of student loan debt. The civil rights movement would not have been possible. John Lewis made $10 a week as chairman of SNCC. They laughed at me again when I said that. But within 6 months of that speech, March had been adopted by the largest public school system in the country, New York City Public Schools, for system-wide use. And the New York Federal Reserve issued their first report on the economic dangers of student loan debt. And when we look at where we are now, with student loan debt finally being at the forefront, yes, it's nearly 10 years later, but this is what the congressman talks about. This is not the struggle of a day, a week, a month, or a year. It is a struggle of a lifetime, of many lifetimes. It's actually quite remarkable within 8 years from elevating that issue. Then the next year you saw Bernie Sanders put it on the presidential conversation. Now it's in the national conversation. And now Democrats have embraced it as a fundamental campaign issue, as an issue of fairness.
Yeah.
It's amazing the power of these ideas, right? So March does all these things. It gives us all these platforms and the ability to discuss the holistic oppression of young people. And all the different ways and tools and tactics that are used to keep them from exercising their power. And March gives them a vehicle to understand what that power is. And it leads to this uprising in 2020, perhaps arguably the most successful uprising among disenfranchised and oppressed people we've seen since the civil rights movement in the United States. Mm-hmm. And the congressman calls it the March generation. Mm-hmm. And then he passes away less than 2 months later. And what do we see after that? We see book bans, and we see something called divisive concepts legislation. Now, the people who are opposed to March, they understood they could not attack it head on. They understood what happened when the former president came after John Lewis. They saw how people reacted. March became the best-selling book in the world. In the world. So they couldn't attack us head on. So they came up with this divisive concepts legislation. They reframed it. They made up a word, CRT. It doesn't mean what they say it means. CRT doesn't even exist in primary or secondary education. It's a theoretical academic term that's in no school. There is not a single high school in America that teaches CRT. They had to make up a boogeyman. And they did it because we succeeded. And because they were too afraid to take us on directly. And then the congressman isn't around to fight back and to frame this. Mm-hmm. And all that's left is me, who's heartbroken and hiding in the woods because I lost my father. Mm-hmm. I lost my mentor. And I was broken. And so in the last year, I've come back. I'm back on the road. I'm speaking out about these things. I've had hundreds of people reach out to me all across the country who talk to me about the different ways in which people are attacking March. Sometimes it's direct, and then they back off. There's this phenomenon that's happening that we're not talking about, which is soft banning. In a number of prisons around the United States, March is effectively soft banned. What they do is they won't allow you to send in a physical copy. They won't allow you to buy a physical copy, but they will allow you to buy a digital copy for an exorbitant price. And the only money you can use to buy that copy is your commissary money. So they force the inmates to literally choose between food, health items, and a book. And we're seeing in Florida, they tried this. The librarians fought back. The librarians would not be beaten. So then they introduced this divisive concepts legislation, which is meant to put a chilling effect on teachers bringing new books into the classrooms. It gives the right of civil action, which means any Yahoo with a law degree can sue them for doing something they don't like, which is nebulously defined and totally the antithesis of the supposed Republican platform of small government. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's the epitome of hypocrisy. Nate and I did an op-ed about this last year, and it ran in the Washington Post. They gave us a whole page, and we made it as a comic book. We tried to explain this. We tried to sound this warning. But it's getting so bad, and they are being successful because they are being funded by millions and millions and millions of dollars. You see things like Moms for Liberty standing up and attacking. They're running for school boards. They saw what we were able to do with a single comic book.
Right.
And it's taking all of this effort, all of this organizing, all this money to try and fight back against what we did, which is pretty remarkable. And in some ways, I am really proud of being such a craw in their bonnet. But that doesn't mean we can be complacent. That means now we really have to step up. Now we need to make sure that every school can teach March, has the resources to teach March, has the necessary training to teach March, and that every student in America graduates having read all of March so that they understand their power and so that they can then fight back on these issues that have been created to take away their power, like student loan debt.
Don't stop talking.
That's so awesome.
Yeah.
I need a little water.
Yeah, no, you know, it was interesting because that was sort of one of my questions, and you've kind of answered it, but sort of the influence on the congressman's life of the death of Martin Luther King and Emmett Till, and then the Board versus Brown and Rosa, all of these events that happened, the Montgomery, you know, boycott, etc. And I wonder, you know, all of these things that he saw, and then the things that he was able, just as you have said, this journey, it may have taken 10 years, but right, the seeds are planted and the roots are strong. If he were with us today, I wonder what, you know, you said he's not here to fight back, but what would he make of some of the things that you've talked about? What would he, you know, would he be, I'm sure he wouldn't be discouraged, but it's just, I wonder if you can speak to that, because it's.
Well, look, I mean, in some ways it comes back to when the very first panel the congressman and I did for March at the San Diego Comic-Con in July of 2013. And I started off the panel and I said, how many of y'all have watched Battlestar Galactica? And I said, if you know the quote, there's a quote from the show that says, all of this has happened before and all of this will happen again.
Yeah.
And I think the congressman would recognize this as the same forces that he was fighting 50 or 60 years ago. I think I know what he would say, which is that we have made a tremendous amount of progress. And he would say we have come too far to go back now. I think what we have to be mindful of is that this is a baton that has been passed through multiple generations. Whether it was A. Philip Randolph in 1941 with Bayard Rustin proposing the first March on Washington, and then chairing that March on Washington with Dr. King and the Big Six 22 years later in 1963. Dr. King carrying that baton until he was assassinated. John Lewis and Julian Bond and Bernard Lafayette and Reverend Lawson and C.T. Vivian and Diane Nash and Fannie Lou Hamer and all of Ella Baker and all of these fantastic activists picking up that baton and carrying it forward. John Lewis going to work for the Voter Education Project after the Robert Kennedy campaign, and going and registering thousands and thousands of Black people throughout the South to vote. This is all about, are we ready to simply pick up the baton and continue the work?
Yeah.
The congressman would also say, we all have a role to play. We all have a contribution we can make. And it wasn't always, even for John Lewis, he wasn't always making the same kind of contribution. Mm-hmm. Sometimes he was an administrator. Sometimes he was an organizer. Mm-hmm. Sometimes he was an orator. Sometimes he was a legislator. His role changed throughout his life because he reinvented himself based on where he could do the most good. And I think for my own self, you know, I was a staffer. I spent a large part of my life. Then I became an author. And now I don't quite know what I am anymore. I'm a creator in residence at Georgia State. I'm also a North Carolina Democratic Party State Executive Committee member. I'm all the things you read in that bio. But everything I do, it's because I'm trying to help people. And I think our lives change, and we have to be able to change with it. And I think that's what the congressman would say to us today, which is that get out there and fix a problem. Yeah. Do the work.
Yeah. I do have, and then kind of, I'm sorry, I'll let you. What I was struck in reading this trilogy was over and over again the unwavering belief, and more than a belief, but that this was, they were willing to die for this, right? And I was, you know, as I'm watching or looking at your work, I'm thinking, you know, knowing that dogs are going to attack you, a high probability, knowing that the fire hoses, knowing that you may get beaten. Where where is that now? Where are we, right? What will it take for us to have that same commitment? That's what it is, right? To risk our very life, to risk our financial, right? Because people who dropped out, it shows they dropped out of university, or they finished, but they didn't go in there, right? All of this is so, I think we forget about that. And where do we get that to take this on when this baton is passed?
I think it's out there. I think there are people protesting on the front lines and organizing on the front lines. I see them a lot in the different programs that I participate in. But I think we also have to acknowledge the reality and the differences that have come, these changes that have been made in response to the success of the civil rights movement. And I'll give you some examples. For instance, in Georgia, we recently saw the General Assembly pass legislation that makes nonviolent civil disobedience an act of domestic terrorism. Right? So we've talked about earlier the different ways in which they've tried to stop students from even engaging in activism. But we haven't talked about the over-criminalization of protest in response. It's anytime, I think, many of these activists participate in nonviolent civil disobedience, they are putting their lives on the line. We've seen protesters in Georgia and elsewhere be shot and killed by the police.
Yeah.
And then the follow to that is that then the protesters who are arrested, it's not like it was during John Lewis's time where they may face a fine or they may face a jail term of a few weeks or a few months. These people are being put in jail for decades. Decades. And so when you wonder why you don't hear them, it's because they don't get back out.
Right.
It's because they're going to face these domestic terrorism charges. And that's the reality we have to see right now, which is that in conservative, they are using the laws much in the same ways that the sheriffs during the movement did to discourage protests. I'll give you a specific example. When you look at John Lewis's speech from the March on Washington, he refers to the SNCC staff members who are on death row who are protesting down in Albany, or
That's
Albany,
right.
they say. This is how they stopped the movement in Albany, right? They made the charges so extreme. They weren't able to fill up the jails, so that they moved prisoners and they had more resources to be able to keep people in prison for longer. They're using the same tactics of the successful white supremacists from the civil rights movement, and then they're building on it. It's why we have such a large criminal justice system. Think about it too. In certain contexts, we haven't updated the dollar amounts that constitute the difference between a misdemeanor and a felony in decades.
Well, some places have.
We're not in Georgia.
Oh, in Maryland, most definitely.
Maryland's, we can say nice things about Maryland, but in the deep South, where much of this fight is happening, they have criminalized everything except for going to the bathroom, and even in some cases that, right? And we've got to acknowledge how these elected leaders have studied the civil rights movement and are deploying the same tactics and new tactics that are learning from the ways in which young people were able to succeed in the past.
Yeah. I needed to hear that, so thank you.
Oh, this is making me want to get a copy of the trilogy and send it to everybody that I know and all the young people. And I love, hearing about getting those books into schools and getting and how many young people are being exposed through your work to not just the history lesson, which is really important and relevant, but the inspiration and the knowledge about how to do this work. So that's just an incredible highlight. I do want to say we got a question early from one of our very faithful library fans or followers, one of our favorite people, Ms. Vivian. And she really early on asked, why did you write this book? And so I want to elevate it. And I'm wondering if, I know you've touched on some of it, but I'm hoping you can answer her question. And if you could also kind of illuminate how you went with the graphic novel and where that came from.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Vivian. That's a great question. It all started in 2008. on the congressman's reelection campaign when I was serving as his press secretary. And as I mentioned, it was a very difficult time for him. And we started having these conversations amongst the staff and with Congressman Lewis about how do we answer these questions and these sort of charges that John Lewis, what have you done for me lately? All these people who didn't understand the true depth and nature of his history and what he had done. And this was at the same time as I was hearing many of these stories for the first time. And so as it was coming down to the end of the campaign, we were starting to talk about what we were going to do afterwards. And as I mentioned, I was a big, and still am, a big comic book fan. And so when it was my turn to say what I was going to do, I admitted I was going to Dragon Con, which is a little bit of a rowdy comic book convention in Atlanta. And everybody laughed at me. And then the congressman said, don't laugh. There was a comic book during the movement, and it was deeply influential. And that was the first time I heard of Martin Luther King and the Montgomery story. And I remember being so amazed that there was a comic book that had played a role in the movement, because it was like the two parts of it was like my heart and my brain coming together in a single object. Mm-hmm. So I went home that night and I looked it up on the internet. And it was beautiful. It was 16 pages cover to cover, the studio house style from the 1950s. It was an introduction to Rosa Parks and Gandhi and nonviolence and Martin Luther King and the bus boycotts. And I remember sitting there thinking, with all these questions rolling around in my brain about how do we tell John Lewis's story. And I just remember sitting there thinking, well, why isn't there a John Lewis comic book? Which seems like a really simple question, right? It just seemed like totally self-evident to me at the time. And so I go back to work. We have another one of those meetings. And they say, does anybody have any new ideas? Because pretty much all the ideas at that point are, we should do a John Lewis documentary. And bless their hearts, there have been about a half a dozen John Lewis documentaries, and I don't think any one of them has made it yet. And so, and I'm in a bunch of them, right?
Was that a Southern, bless their hearts? I'm sorry, please.
I'm from the South. I can't. And I remember after I suggested, so I go to this meeting and I remember I raised my hand like a schoolboy, right? I mean, that's how I felt. And I remember the congressman looking at me a little cockeyed going, yes, young man. And I said, well, Congressman, I think you should write a comic book. And there was absolute silence, right? Just total silence in the room. And a reporter later asked the congressman, what did you think when he first suggested you write a comic book? And he leaned in and he goes, I thought that boy had lost his mind. But to me, it seems so self-evident, right? And so it kind of, we moved on. And then I kept thinking about it. And I was like, really, this is like, we actually really should do this. Like, I got him on social media. How hard could it be to get him to write a comic book, right?
Right.
And so I kept asking and I kept asking. And finally, it was the last week of the campaign. And we were campaigning over off Wallace Road in Southwest Atlanta, which was just down the street from his house. And it was in the afternoon, and in the South, you get these afternoon thunderstorms. And there was a flash of lightning, and everybody looked up. And by the time we looked back down, John Lewis had taken off in a suit and tie, I will add, and a full sprint back to the car. And before the thunder rolled, we started chasing after him. We head back and we dive into the car, and the rain starts to come down, and it's patter, patter, patter on the roof. And one of the interns who was in the car suggested that I ask the congressman one more time about that comic book idea. In fact, she said, you should ask him again. He can't go anywhere now. And so I did. And the congressman got that grin that we've all seen, like on his mugshots, right? That little bit of a smirk. And he turned around, he looked at me, and he said, okay, I'll do it, but only if you write it with me. That's where it all started. And I think it's worth noting, right? Because this gets lost. It took the congressman and I over 2 years to find a publisher. Everybody said no. It wasn't until we were introduced to a publisher that, like I said, had 4 people, including the warehouse guy, that they said yes. We had no agent. We had no lawyer. I was very fortunate that a friend of mine from elementary school had gone on to work at a literary agency. So he had been funneling me email addresses, and I was just cold calling and cold emailing all these editors, trying to find somebody who who understood what it was we were trying to do. And I pitched March over the table at a comic convention. And I was paying for all this travel and research and everything because I was in grad school at the same time, right? And you can take out extra student loan debt for cost of living. And I was using that money to pay for this travel and to pay for the postage and to pay for the research and the printer that you inevitably need, like all this sort of stuff, right? And it was finally, I remember, I never got an explicit yes, but one publisher said, well, I don't know how well you can write. So why don't you take the next 2 or 3 months, write as much of it as you can, send it to me, and I will read it, and I will make a decision. So I went, and I spent the next 3 months writing essentially what became 100 pages of script, and sent it to him, and he said yes, and that's where it started. And I'd say that's where it started. Then we had to get the Congressional Ethics, the Office of Ethics, Congressional Office. They had to review every publishing contract that a member of Congress signs because of Newt Gingrich, because he took $300,000 and some odd advance for a book that sold a few hundred copies. And so then this meant that there was this legal standard where a publishing agreement had to be normal and customary. But there'd never been a publishing agreement signed for any member of Congress to write a comic or graphic novel. So we had to then establish a new legal precedent within the House to get the publishing agreement approved. Every step of the way, we had to do something that nobody else had done. We had to work twice as hard just to get there. And then when we actually finally really got into working on it, I remember I finished the first draft, and by this point it was late 2011, early 2012, and we had recruited Nate Powell, the artist, and sent him the first draft, and then we met at the San Diego Comic-Con in 2012, and he told me that this book was too big to illustrate anytime soon. It would take years. And so I suggested maybe we should break the book up. And I said, what about 2 books? And he said, that's still going to take me 2 or 3 years to draw that first book. So, okay, what about 3 books? I'll make the first one short. And that's how we came to book 1. That's how we broke it up into a trilogy. And I think that ultimately was the best thing because it allowed us to have essentially a perpetual campaign so that we could both have new books continue to come out. We could continue to promote the old ones. It gave us this real opportunity. But at the end of the day, to answer the fundamental question, I wrote this book and I worked this hard on this book because it gave John Lewis joy. It solved so many problems for him, but it gave him joy. When I met him in 2000, when I worked for him on the campaign in 2008, I'll never forget, he said to me, he was so down, he said, I'm worth more dead than alive. His wife was sick. His staff was in trouble. Everything seemed like it was going wrong. And so over those years, March gave him a new prominence. It made him happy. It helped him keep going. I remember he used to call me every Friday at noon because that was when the New York Times published that week's bestseller lists. And we had to speak in code because not everybody was as thrilled about him being on the bestseller list as he was. And so he would just say, do you have any good news for me? And I would say, yes, sir. I have one very good piece of good news, or I have 2 pieces, or I have 3 pieces. And that's how I could tell him how many of them were on the bestseller list. And then he would ask me, how good? And I would say very good. And then it was at the top. I would say pretty good. It was in the middle or somewhere in there. But I remember one time he called me from India because he was on a Codel. It must have been like 4 a.m. And he wanted to know, like clockwork.
Wow.
And it gave him joy. it gave him, and I think about this now too, where like we would be on the road 100 days a year.
That's a lot.
And it was grueling. I mean, you
Yeah.
know, my dog forgot who I was. You know, it was.
Yes.
And I think about like I can't do that now. And sometimes, you know, like a publisher or something will be like, well, you used to do this. Can't you do this now? And it's like I was able to have the stamina and the ability to do this because John Lewis and I were in it together.
Yeah.
Because we had we had each other.
Yeah.
And I saw how much joy it gave him. I mean, to be very frank, very candid with you, sometimes we had to deal with some pretty obnoxious people. And nowadays, I don't want to deal with them.
Yeah.
But I put up with a lot of that because of John Lewis, because he deserved it, because that's what it took to succeed. And I think about it in this context, too, of like, what if we hadn't done that?
Yeah.
What if we hadn't taught all these millions of young people how to protest, about their history, about their power? Where would we be as a country now if with the former president and these massive conspiracies and everything coming, we had no way of knowing it. But in some ways, we built this dam that stopped the tide of fascism from walking and rolling across America. And I think now I feel like my purpose is it's different. I can't make another march, right? Which is kind of what people get obsessed with. I can make books, I can elevate other people, but also I can teach other people the lessons that we learned, how we did this. Now I understand the tactics far better than almost anybody. I understand the civil rights movement far better than any other person in my generation. And I think this is what's scary to me, is that the civil rights movement is almost no longer within living memory.
Right. Yes.
And what happens then?
Yeah.
What happens when my memories of John Lewis are what's left in our living memory?
Yeah.
What responsibility and obligation do I then have? John Lewis always said it was his obligation to bear witness. And I've begun to feel this steady pressure that now this is my obligation. This is my responsibility. And it's strange because, you know, I get invited to speak, but it's different now. It used to be John Lewis and I like back on the road, having fun. Now it's a heavy responsibility that I have to carry by myself. And I'm glad to do it. I've gotten to speak at dozens of colleges and universities in the past few months. I'll be speaking at Virginia Tech on Monday, helping them kick off their school year. And I think in some ways, this is one of the most important things I can do, which is my responsibility now to bear witness and to tell these stories and to keep my memories in living memory in this next generation, so that it's not just March that they read, but that they know that that young man that they see in those books, staffing the congressman, suggesting he should write a comic book, is just like them. And that they too can have an idea and make it into a reality that far exceeds their expectations. Yeah. And what that means, like, just before my mother died, now let me tell you, my mother, it was me and her against the world. And if you ever see my National Book Award speech, I dedicated the award to my mother. Because I grew up poor. My mother would say we were 99-cent Whopper poor, because the only time we went out to eat was when Whoppers were 99 cents. And Mama, I'll never forget, she after we won those awards for the American Library Association, it meant that I had more than one medal. And my mother was keeping count. And she said, "Can I have one of the medals?" She's like, "You have enough. Can I have one?" And I gave her my National Book Award medal. And it's this big old honking Flavor Flav looking medal. And I came home and I found my mother wearing it around the house. And I asked my mom, when we were growing up, when it was so hard, did you ever think that I would do anything like this? Like maybe not the National Book Award, but it was something. And my mother said, Andrew, I love you with all of my heart. But no, I didn't. And I was so offended at the time, right? Like, oh, come on, Mom. Like, you had to, you know. But then I really thought about it because she passed away a few months later after that. And I thought about that moment a lot.
Mm.
And it meant that I had surpassed my mother's wildest dreams for me and for her.
Mm.
That something like this was just never possible for us because we weren't from the right place. We didn't have a fancy zip code. We didn't have the money or the influence or the connections. And that I then had this responsibility to show other generations that that is still possible in America. And people like John Lewis are your path. That mentorship,
Mm.
that mutual aid that we gave each other is your path.
Yeah.
And then just before, or just after my mother passed, I had to go to the courthouse to get death certificates. And I'm waiting in line, and somebody asked me what I was there for, and I said I was getting, some documents. And they said, oh, that's right, she passed away. Are you her son? Yeah. And they said, I saw her a few weeks ago. She was at the grocery store, and she was wearing this big old medal. Do you know why she was wearing it? I was like, oh, my God, my mother wore the medal to the grocery store. And, I mean, I think about this with John Lewis, too, right? Because his parents were so proud of him and everything that he went through. And we do not, we look at these moments, we look at these books, we look at these successes, and we don't think about what it means to that mother. We don't think about what it means to the woman who sacrificed everything to give me the opportunity to go and get a scholarship to college, to learn how to do this. The son that did not come home nearly enough in her last years because I was doing 100 days on the road with John Lewis, preaching the gospel of nonviolence. The sacrifice that meant for her of living her last years, not being able to be as close to the person that she loved most in the world. We don't think about that, and we should, and we have to. And so I end up talking about my mother quite a bit, and I'll get all emotional if I keep going. But anyway, that was a really long answer to your question about why we wrote that book.
Yeah, but it's so good for us to hear. It is so good for us to hear. I encourage everyone, get the trilogy if you have not already. Get it.
I really appreciate that story, and I really appreciate you being here with us, Andrew. Like it's like I'm definitely in the feelings in all the best ways. So I really want to thank you for like what you're saying about your mom and what you gave to her and what she gave to you. That really resonates for me, and I appreciate that. I do want to say, unfortunately, I always hate this part, which is my unpleasant duty to say one more at a time. But I do want to take, if I can, just a couple minutes for people who are listening and we'll be watching later. So first off, you've joined us tonight. We're so grateful that you chose to spend your evening with us. But if you're tuning in later, thank you so much for tuning in. You've heard some incredible words today from Andrew. You've heard obviously incredible things about the congressman, but also about action and how we still have power and those things we can do, and about family and about heart. And one of the best ways that we can thank Andrew for his time and being here and also keep the journey going and the fight and the march is to purchase the books. And you can get them from your favorite independent bookstore. You can also get them from Andrew's favorite independent bookstore. If you have one, Andrew, not to put you on the spot, do you want to shout out to any bookstore you like people to get your books from?
Oh, absolutely. Well, in DC, I like East City Books, which is near where I used to live. And then in Atlanta, I was just at Postman Books, but I also recommend, you can get it even at Criminal Records, the comic book / record store, or your local comic shop, or you can also go to IndieBound and look up your local bookstore that way. And if you need any signed copies or anything like that, you can just get them through my website, which is andrewaydin.com.
So thank you so much. And we also, of course, you can get them from, if you're not in a position to purchase one, you can also get it out from the library. I know that our library system printer is kind of a memorial library system because our event partners for this evening have some, but hopefully your local library has them if you're not tuning in from this area. It has been so phenomenal to have you, Andrew. I do want to say, if you want to make a little bit of a drive after you're at Virginia Tech, we will all take you out for dinner / lunch, whatever you need, both. I mean, we'll just do whatever you need. But we really, really, really appreciate you taking the time to be with the people of Prince George's County and the region tonight, and for all the work that you have been doing for years to elevate social justice and civil rights. Thank you so much.
No, thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to look back, to celebrate what we've done, but also to look forward and know that we have a lot of work to do.
Yeah. And please, we would love to have you back when you have completed.
Yes.
Yes.
The
You
goal
know,
is
I'd love to do something in person. I want to come see you all.
Yeah.
Okay. It's recorded. We have it.
Right.
So we're going to sign off, but don't leave us, Andrew.
Okay.
Right.
Don't sign off when we're signing.
Right, but we all say goodnight to everybody who's watching us
Please
at
stay
home.
there.
And again, thank you so much, everybody, for being with us. We really we do this for you, and we're so glad that you tuned in. All right, good night.
Thank you.
Have a good night, everyone.